to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as my role as host of this program, will endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, the scripture, the tradition, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the saints, the doctors, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every week on Wednesday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And usually at the top of the program, I have some topic that I would like to cover. And absolutely nothing today. So you have a free-for-all for questions. Just a couple of rules. When you ask your question, put the word question in capital letters before your question so that looking at this scroll that goes up and down, I can easily spot a question and devote my time to it. And try to hold your questions maybe to 2, possibly 3 questions to give other people a chance who haven't been able to ask questions because they come in late or, whatever the reason, they're just watching it for a while and then decide to ask a question. So we want to give everybody a chance. And let me see, what else do we have? Oh, just one advertisement. And as I've been pushing our movie coming up, still not done, but I am assured by the producer that it will be ready before January ends. I can tell you that much. So making movies is a art in itself. This one, as you know, How the World Was Made in 6 Days. This is day 1, an hour and a half long on day 1, believe it or not. And we've already published our introduction 17-minute video that you can find on the Colby website, colbycenter.org, or you can find it on robertsongenis.org. And very exciting project we're taking on that I know you will enjoy, and you can get first dibs on the day 1 by purchasing it now at either of those websites I just mentioned. And just sit back and get the popcorn with your family and enjoy day 1 as soon as it comes out. So that's the only advertisement I had. So we can get right to your questions. Now, the only thing today is I have to cut the program short by 15 minutes. So on Eastern Standard Time, I will depart here at 4:45 because I have some urgent business to attend to. And that's the only obstacle we have to overcome. So with that, you can begin to ask your questions. And now someone did ask a question last week that I told him I would have an answer to today, and I do have an answer. So the question was concerning the name of God, Yahweh, otherwise known as the Tetragrammaton. It's 4 letters in Hebrew. That's spelled, and sometimes you'll see it spelled Jehovah. Jehovah's Witnesses, as a matter of fact, use that because we're just not quite sure how the Yod. Now we even say Yod, and that begins with a Y. We don't say Jod. So I don't know. I think more scholars tend toward Yahweh than they do Jehovah. And the other letter in the Tetragrammaton, it's 4 letters, is the Vav. Now that's spelled W-A-W, but we pronounce it V-A-W. So a lot of discrepancies with those pronunciations. At any rate, you'll even see, for example, when Jesus said, in, was it Matthew chapter 5, verse 18, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Not one jot or tittle. Now we use the J there, jot. But you could actually say yacht and be correct in Hebrew. And a tittle, that's well pronounced. But just wanted to let you know that whenever you see Yahweh or Jehovah, they're just different pronunciations for the same Hebrew word. And that was the word for God. That was the personal name of God. There's even other ways to pronounce it. You could pronounce it Yahweh. Yahweh. I don't know if there's any Jews who write to you, but there's some very religious Jews out there. And when they write to me, they'll, instead of writing God or Lord, they'll just put a line. Because they weren't allowed to say the name of God in a lot of Hebrew culture, even up until today. So if you ever see a Jew doing that, you know why. So the question was, Exodus 6 verse 3 says, in most of your translations, it says, they did not know me by my name, Yahweh. And it's unfortunate, but, well, let me just go on. But in Genesis 15:8, you have the one time, or one of the times, that Abraham knew the Lord by the name Yahweh or Yahweh. And so if Exodus 6:3 is saying they did not know me by my name Yahweh, then what's the deal? As a matter of fact, the personal name of God, Yahweh, is pronounced, or it is written in the Hebrew Bible 171 times before you get to Exodus 6 verse 3. It's written in Genesis, Exodus, Genesis and Exodus 171 times before you get to Exodus 6:3. So, you know, something's wrong here. We need to fix it. And it's unfortunate. And I looked up all the translations that I have on my computer Bible, which is about maybe 24. And they all have an indicative statement in Exodus 6:3. They did not know me by my name, Yahweh. And which means nobody got it right. Of all those translations, and there's hundreds more out there. And that's because sometimes the Hebrew is not as specific or clear as it could be. Because in Hebrew, they didn't have any question marks. They didn't have any dots after the indicative statement that says, this is an indicative statement. You can tell by the dot at the end. And we can tell a question statement because we put a question mark at the end of a sentence. In Spanish, they put the question mark at the beginning and the end of the sentence. So that distinguishes an interrogative sentence from an indicative sentence. But in Hebrew, they did not have such. Even in Greek, they did not have such. So we know the statement is indicative or interrogative because of the context, okay? And this is one of those cases, unfortunately, the translations miss this, but this is one of those cases in Exodus 6:3 where it should be an interrogative. And so the sentence should read, did they not know me by my name, Yahovah or Yahweh? You see? And that makes all the difference in the world. Because that means we have the reason for why the Yahovah or Yahweh appears 171 times before Exodus 6:3. Right in Genesis 2, we have the word Yehovah or Yahweh. And all throughout Genesis, they're calling God Yahweh. So it only makes sense that Exodus 6:3 is not making an indicative statement, it's making an interrogative statement. And sometimes in English, the way you would do this is, if it was indicative, it would say, they did not know me by my name Jehovah. And then to turn that into an interrogative, you would put the did not before. Did not they know me by my name Jehovah? You see how easy it is to make that into a question rather than an indicative statement. So that's basically what's going on here. Okay. And like I said, it's unfortunate that translations didn't connect this up, and because if you put it as an indicative statement, obviously you've just made a contradiction. So I mean, it's not like Jehovah is just mentioned a couple times. It's mentioned 171 times. So yeah, you got to do some grammatical adjustment there and understand that Hebrew does not have a question mark, so you have to make it into a question. Okay, and that's just the nature of the beast. So there you go. All right, so we are going to get to your questions and see what is on tonight. Okay, Antonio Sameti says, how did Noah store the food needed to feed the herbivorous animals in the ark for almost a year? Wouldn't some foods needed for some species have gone bad? What about seasonal foods? Well, I think there's two ways to answer this. Herbivorous are plant-eating animals, as opposed to carnivorous, which would be meat-eating animals. Let me first tackle the carnivorous so that we can get a balance here. If you read the Genesis text, Genesis 6-9, you'll see that Noah took in 2 of every animal of the clean and unclean, but he took in 7 pairs of clean animals. And that was because, and I think I explained this last week, they were going to eat, the carnivorous animals were going to eat the 7 pairs of clean animals. So that is not a problem. The other thing I would want to say is that Noah did not take in every single animal that was on the face of the earth. Okay. In other words, maybe that's the wrong way to say it. He didn't take in 2 of every animal that was on the face of the earth. Okay. He would only take in a representative of a certain species of animal. For example, he did not take in a Chihuahua and a German Shepherd dog. He took in one representative of the dog family, whatever that would be. And most people think it would have been a wolf kind of animal, but it was the dog species. And because of the DNA that was in this representative, that DNA was built so that it would vary into different kinds of dogs. And so if there were different kinds of dogs already in Noah's day, and there would have been, he would only take like the archetype, or so the animal that he knew best represented the dog family. Okay, before we had all kinds of dogs. and that would be the representative. So it wouldn't be difficult then, first of all, to get a dog species representative, and it wouldn't be difficult to feed them because you only have one of its kind in the ark. Okay. And the same would be true of the other animals, however they were classified at that time. Now Noah had 120 years to figure this out. Okay, because remember it says in Genesis 6, my spirit will not strive with man, he will have 120 years. So we figure that's the time Noah is building the ark. He's figuring out the structure of the ark. Well, God already told him, so many cubits by so many cubits. And he's figuring out how to get the animals, how to feed them and all that. So he's got a lot of time to figure all these things out. So by the time the rains come and the water from beneath starts bursting out, he's well prepared. Now, as far as, plant-eating animals, what they would have done at that time was they would have grown their own plants. Okay, this is another thing he had to figure out. The ark was pretty big. The number of animals would be limited because you get a certain species. So you've got enough room there to grow plants. After the rain stopped, after 40 days, there would be a hole in the roof for sunlight. So you could have photosynthesis occurring among the plants. And he would have put the plant boxes in designated places so the sunlight would come through and hit those plants and grow the plants. Okay. And he would grow the plants that were easiest to grow. And he would, give them the proper water. Of course, they had plenty of that. And all that would take to grow the plants. So you wouldn't have to have. Now, seeds you could store because they're hard and they, don't deteriorate that quickly. But green plants or things like that would deteriorate quickly. Yeah, you would grow them. Just like we hold green plants around our house, maybe for a week at the most, and you have to go get new sources. So his new source would be the plants that he was growing. So that. Again, he had 120 years to figure all this out, and voila. Okay. Question from Peter. Do you believe that the Pentateuch that we have today is the original one with all the anachronisms? What do you think about documentary hypothesis, which is inspired, autographs or translation? All right, so let's start from the bottom here. Translations are never inspired, okay? God spoke once, the writer wrote them down, and those were the inspired autographs, okay? We have several instances wherein we find that Moses, it says, wrote down all the words of the law that the Lord spoke to him. Exodus 24, verse 4, and Exodus 24, verse 7 say that. Deuteronomy 31 does the same thing. Okay, so Moses was inspired, and that's it, just Moses. And it tells us several times that he's the one writing this. And so they would have preserved his writings, and at certain times they would have made copies of his writings. And the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And so that's how that would work there. As you say, is it the original one? No, we don't have the original Pentateuch. As a matter of fact, we don't have any of the original books of the Bible. None, zero, zilch. All that we have are copies, okay, of the original. Now, the original of Moses probably wrote them on stone. in Hebrew, and they carried these stone tablets with them wherever they went. You know, they're traveling through the desert, they go to Jericho, Canaan, they take over Canaan, and they have these tablets with them. Okay. And once you write them in stone, they're not going to change. So nobody can mess with them. So that's one reason why the Hebrew, more than the Greek, is preserved very well, because not much you can do after you write it in stone. We often use that expression, is this written in stone? Meaning it's never going to change. So yeah, literally Moses wrote it on stone, so it would never change. And and then the Hebrews have been noted, both before Christ and after Christ, to be very meticulous about the word of God, the word of the Lord. And it's funny. It's like, when the old Rolls-Royce company, after they got done building a Rolls-Royce, the most expensive car, at least at that time, back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, if they would start the engine up, and if they found one sound from that engine that they didn't like or was funny, or one creepy noise when they got into the car and sat down, they would take the whole car apart and build it again. That was the famous reason Rolls Royces became so popular, at least for those that could afford them, because you knew you were getting a car that was top notch, without any flaws. And the same thing with the Hebrews. If they copied a manuscript and then had somebody check it, and if he came across one mistake, say it was in the first sentence, one mistake, as a matter of fact, it could have been a yod or a tittle, as Jesus said. Not one yod or jot or tittle should pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Well, if they found that you made a mistake on a yod or a tittle or anything else, they'd throw the whole manuscript out and start over again. Okay. So that's how meticulous they were with the Word of God. The Greek's a little different because you had mostly the monks copying the Greek manuscripts. And that's why most of them come from the Middle Ages. And they've assigned numbers to them, and there's thousands of them. And different monasteries would copy copies, So in order to copy a copy, you have to make sure the original copy is accurate, okay? And they were very meticulous. These guys, these monks, did nothing all day long except copy Greek manuscripts for you and for me, okay? So, and that was a tedious job, very tedious. You'd get tired and you'd get dyslexic and you'd put the word in the wrong place or miss a letter or this or that. And sometimes even the guy that checked up on you would miss it. And so the mistake would persist throughout all the copies. And we can look at these copies and we can see the same mistake is in this copy and this copy and this copy of this particular book, this particular paragraph. So we're pretty sure we know where the source of the mistake was, okay? And this is the whole art of textual criticism, which is very valuable because sometimes one word, if it's missing from the text or somebody added a word that shouldn't be added, it could change the meaning of the whole text, okay? Just like we saw with Exodus 6, verse 3, okay? Where if it's an indicative, it's saying one thing, and if it's an interrogative, it's saying quite another thing. And if it's in the indicative, well, then it's going to contradict all those other times that Yahweh is used in the Old Testament. Okay, so you can understand what a meticulous art this is. But now we have them. And then they found some other new manuscripts. In the 1800s, they found more Greek manuscripts through a guy named Tischendorf. And then they found even more in the Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1948, it was all by happenstance. Somebody throws a pebble into a cave, just playing a game, and he hears a tinkling sound, as if you threw a stone against some metal. And he's wondering, what the heck is that? And so they go up to the cave where they were playing a game. They throw these stones, and they find all these giant, whatever you call them, vessels. And they looked in the vessels, and they found all these old manuscripts, Hebrew, Greek, you name it. And so that was a very valuable find. So now, the monks had a certain variety of Greek manuscripts that they were working with, and we know what they are. And then you got these new manuscripts, and they seem to be even more important or more valuable than some of the Greek manuscripts that were used by the monks in the Middle Ages. So, and we have one of them housed right at the Vatican called Codex Vaticanus. And that was written around the 4th century, 4th or 5th century. And so it's very old. And they can tell you, how old these things are just by the paper. Well, they didn't have paper back then. They had what they called vellum, which was a leather, thin pieces of leather that they wrote on. And they could tell you, if this is written in leather, that means it came from, the 3rd, 4th, or 5th century, 5th, 6th century. And anything before that was written in an Egyptian kind of paper called papyrus from like the 2nd, 3rd century and around there. And that was a totally different kind of paper, and it didn't last as long. And so we just have fragments usually of papyrus. But they were even more valuable than Codex Vaticanus because they're older. The usual way you determine these things in textual criticism is that the oldest has the precedence. But that's not true all the time. It's not true all the time. It usually is true, but not in every case. Okay, and that makes it a little bit more difficult, to determine, well, okay, what's the correct text then? And sometimes you get the texts that were written around the Greek texts, Greek copies that were written around the 4th and 5th century disagree with one another. Okay, so that makes it difficult. Anyway, just to clear up the issue, we don't have any of those original copies. All we have are copies. And we have copies of copies and copies of copies of copies. Okay? But in all that, the meticulous nature of this art of copying, we have less than 1% of all the Greek manuscripts, at least, that have any sort of discrepancy. Less than 1%. That's pretty good. So we can trust these copies to be very, very accurate. Okay? And God's letting us know, you can trust these copies. I couldn't preserve the original for you, but you got the copies. And they are just as good as the original in a certain way, okay, because of the percentage of lack of error. Okay. And we know that because we can compare one copy against another, you see. So, but the other side of that story is that in every paragraph, let's say, not every sentence, but in every paragraph, there's at least one discrepancy that one copy has that another copy doesn't have. Okay. So, and that may be just a letter. Usually it is just a letter. Sometimes the difference between an omicron and an omega. And sometimes the copyist would see a potential mistake that may have been a mistake, and then he'll go fix it. And he'll put in what he thinks is the proper letter that belongs there, but he may not be right. Maybe another letter belongs there, or maybe no letter at all belongs there, and the original that he had, or the copy that he had, was actually correct. Okay, so we have to go through all that, make sure we know who was correcting who, and why he thought he had to correct the previous copyist, and so big wide open field. But we're satisfied that there's less than 1% error, so all those copies are good. Now, some people get bothered by this. Some people, they just get bothered that we don't have the original. We just have copies. And it never bothered me, because if you have such a low percentage of error in the copies, what's to be upset about? I mean, come on, man, you've got these copies. And if it wasn't for those monks, or for those Jewish monks, basically, who did the same thing, we wouldn't have the Bible. Okay, so they've done us a good service, and thank God for that. Now, the documentary hypothesis that he is referring to here, it's probably on its way out as being a popular modern scholarly analysis of the Pentateuch. Okay, it was popular, started in the mid 1800s, and then by the late 1800s, two scholars named Graf and Wellhausen made it even more popular, and that became the going theory of how the Pentateuch was put together. And it's just a theory. And let me reiterate, I think I did this last week, and you have to know the culture that some of these theories come from, what was going on in the world, especially the scholarly academic world. What was going on? Well, by the late Renaissance and into the mid-Enlightenment, you had a burgeoning of science like never before. Okay. You got guys like, Newton, Louis Pasteur, Leeuwenhoek, it was just a burgeoning field that nobody could contain. I mean, now we knew that you could do experiments and you could make mathematical equations, and they didn't have this before. The closest we had were the Greeks, with like the Pythagorean theorem and all that with geometry. But as far as, calculus and, analytical geometry and all that stuff, I mean, this was not known. Okay. This is why science is such a competitor with theology, because of the tools it has to go in and get the data. Now, the problem comes in not so much with getting the data. That's easy. All you have to do is make an instrument to get the data. Interpreting the data, that's a whole different ballgame, you see. And interpretation comes from what? It comes from the mind. And the mind is affected by many things. And one of them is this culture that he's in. And the culture of that day, I'm talking about, late Renaissance, early Enlightenment, mid-Enlightenment, was that theology is just a baby compared to the science. We can go in there with a microscope and a telescopes, and get the data, you see. Theology, it's, one theory after another theory, and you can't prove anything. You can't prove God exists, okay? I mean, we've got pretty good evidence, but you can't prove it. In science, we can prove things, you see. So, at least that's the mentality going on here. So now the intellectual world was not only into cosmology and biology and all this kind of stuff, they were into literature. Okay. And so they began to examine writings of various popular authors like Shakespeare or Homer or, whoever it was. And they could analyze it in such a way where they could tell you that, well, this paragraph is sort of a repeat of this paragraph over here that was in chapter 1 and this one in chapter 5. So, was he the original author, or did he add this, or did somebody come along and put it in there that wasn't the original author? And did Shakespeare really write all those plays, or was it somebody else? And the way they get to these conclusions or theories is by examining the text. Okay. And it's another art in itself. And they could become pretty accurate in their analysis, They could tell you the time it was written, who it was written by, what he was influenced by, blah, 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 all down the line. And there's probably a dozen different literary categories that they work on. And what happened was the Bible got into this mix. These guys, they were not Christian, but they say, hey, here's this famous book called the Bible. Let's go analyze it like we analyzed Homer and Shakespeare and figure out where these things really came from, where these stories really came from, and how many authors really were there, and was it really Matthew and Mark, or was it some second century redactor who added this paragraph or that paragraph, or this idea or that idea? And before you know it, the Bible is ripped apart and it's treated like any other book, because all those books, of course, are not inspired by God. Okay. So it's easy to catch their mistakes. And then they go and try to do the same thing with the Bible. And they think if they catch what looks like a mistake, well, that proves that the Bible wasn't inspired, you see. Because obviously this mistake would not appear. Like Matthew says they were 2 blind men, and Luke says they're 1. So we got a mistake here. Somebody made a boo-boo. Okay, so that's the conclusion they would come to, but they would be dead wrong, of course. Because you just can't assume that if one says there's 2 blind men and the other says there's 1, that means there's an error. No, it just means that Luke is focusing on 1 and Matthew's focusing on 2. And Luke just doesn't bother to get into the detail. And we know that about Luke when you read the rest of his gospel. Sometimes Luke is very sketchy about the details of a certain event, and he'll skip right over them. And then you have to go read them in Matthew and Mark to find out what the detail was. And then at other times, Luke focuses in like a razor on a certain event, and he's got more detail than Matthew and Mark combined. Okay? So, see, God was wise when he gave us 4 evangelists to write the Gospels. Okay? So, with this documentary hypothesis that was in the 1800s, basically they were going to do the same thing now to the Old Testament, and particularly the Pentateuch. And they were going to tell you that, well, it couldn't have been Moses who wrote the 5 books, you see, especially since at the end of Deuteronomy, Moses dies, but the writer's still writing about Moses dying. So how could it be Moses? Yeah, okay. So the easy answer to that is, of course, Joshua wrote it, like he wrote the rest of, Joshua, Judges, probably Ruth, or had some other person that he got to do that. Okay. And so that answers that question. But it's these kinds of questions that they will raise. And, one of them might have been Exodus 6:3. See, it says in the indicative, they never knew me by my name, Jehovah. Okay. Well, grammatically, we can answer that, of course, because it's just a question. Did they not know me by my name, Jehovah? I must have repeated it 171 times. So apparently they did. You see, so that's how we would come back. And there's been this war going on for what? 150 years between these, academic scholars who want to go in there and treat the Bible as if it's any other book and find mistake after mistake, so they think. And that's their job, basically, is to dethrone the Bible, is to make it look like any other work that has mistakes. Okay. So they would say, no, Moses is not the author. Some priest, and it wasn't even during the creation. It was, some priest decided to write the first chapter of Genesis because he wanted to make the Jehovah God more important, better than Marduk of the Babylonians, you see. And since the Jews were in captivity in Babylon for 70 years, they were under Marduk for all intents and purposes. Okay. The Babylonian god Marduk, who's a fake, of course. There's no such god as Marduk, but that's what the Babylonians believed. So the Jews are now going to go back to Jerusalem, and what can get you more excited than going back to Jerusalem? If you know that your God, who's just put you in captivity for 70 years, is still a great God, you see, because look what he can do. He created the world out of nothing. Marduk, he has to use this material and that material, and he's a god because another god came before him, you see. So, let me write this chapter, Genesis 1, and make it look like we have this great God. Has nothing to do with creation, you see. He's just trying to, get his Jewish brethren excited for the long trip back to Jerusalem. That's the going theory. That's the documentary hypothesis. Why do they do that? Because they don't believe Genesis is inspired by God. Come on. That's old-fashioned stuff. We don't believe that anymore. These are the universities, you see. The very ones that tell us that, you can get medicines from plants, and now we even make computers and all this good stuff, you see. So we've proved ourselves. All right. So and they convince a lot of people that the Bible basically is just a bunch of stories, legends, myths. Okay. Written by someone in the future that made it look like it was written in the past. Okay. So, and then, we get to Genesis 2, and that seems to be written in a different way than Genesis 1. So but it doesn't quite fit the scenario we just made about the Jews going to Jerusalem and wanting to get excited. It seems to be something a little bit strange, or we just, and so they say, well, that was written in the 7th century BC. Because certain things were going on in Jewish culture, and so they wanted to put an addendum on Genesis 1 called Genesis 2. And we even know this. Why? Because in Genesis 1, God only called himself Elohim. And in Genesis 2, he calls himself Yahweh. personal name, you see. So we have two different contexts here. So they must have been written by two different people. Okay. So they call Genesis 1 the Elohist writer, and they call Genesis 2 the Yahvist writer. Okay. And then you've got two more coming because they have four writers of Genesis altogether. All right. And it just goes on and on and on. All right. So once you well, let me give the other two. You have it's an acronym called JEPD, and E stands for Elohim, J stands for Jehovah or Yahweh, P stands for priestly. So this is a third author they now have for the books, let's say Leviticus, some of Numbers, where this priest of the future is writing this meticulously of what Jewish culture was of that day, and sort of projects it back into the time of Abraham or whoever, and a guy called Moses, who they don't even know existed or not. Okay. And then you have the D stands for the Deuteronomic, another author of Genesis who writes Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy is a little different, you see, than Exodus and Numbers. And so that's their theory. That's a documentary hypothesis. Okay. Now let me just tell you here now, it's a bunch of bunk. Okay. It's just man's way of trying to explain how all these things could have happened if you don't believe in miracles and prophecy and you don't believe in inspiration of God. How are you? Because look, these texts exist and we've got to do something about it. We've got to show the world that we know why these things were written as they were written. And we're men of the world, you see. We don't believe in miracles. We don't believe in prophecy. We don't believe that God inspired men to write anything at all. And so how are we going to explain this to the world? Well, here we use the documentary hypothesis. And a hypothesis it is indeed, because there's absolutely not a shred of proof to it at all. Okay. So there you go. All right, next question. Do we know what happened to dinosaurs? If yes, what? If not, what are most probable hypotheses? Hubert asks. Well, yeah, there were dinosaurs, believe me. And you know, I've gone on dinosaur excavations, and I've read all the books on dinosaur excavations. And yes, they have found human footprints right alongside a dinosaur footprint. Okay, that is a fact. Now, you won't have your secular archaeologist or paleontologist admit to that, but they are there, and I've seen the specimens myself. Okay, so I know they exist. And when you see this big dinosaur foot next to a little human foot, yeah, that says something. That's the data I was telling you about. And they have the ability to go in there and dig these things out and preserve them. But it all depends on the interpretation of the data, you see. If I believe that Genesis is bunk and everything evolved from time eternity, you did from the Big Bang, you know, and evolved over billions of years, and dinosaurs came 65 million years ago, well, there's no way I'm going to believe that a dinosaur print can be next to a human footprint. Okay? So what is driving the interpretation? What's driving the interpretation is the rejection of a divine origin to the world in 6 days, wherein God made all the animals that have existed. Okay? And apparently made some pretty big animals that we know as dinosaurs. And you can find traces of these in the book of Job, Behemoth, Leviathan, whatever. There were some big animals. And whatever your interpretation of these things are, the fact is, that's what they saw. Okay? Giant animals. All right? Warm-blooded animals. So we know they existed. Now, how would they have existed in Noah's Ark? Obviously, he would get a baby dinosaur. You've seen baby dinosaurs, even on, their imaginations on TV. They're pretty small. Okay. And you could get, just a few of the dinosaurs that you believed were the top of the species, that represented the species. And then they, just like the dogs, would have DNA that would vary from generation to generation to produce different kinds of dinosaurs. Okay. Just like you had produced different kinds of dogs from one pair of dog. Okay. So that's easily explainable. Now, where did they go? Well, they died out. If you're a big dinosaur, you're going to need a lot of food. You're going to need a lot of warm temperatures. And as fierce as they might have been toward one another, there's competition. Okay. So you add all these elements together that changed drastically after the flood, because this world was ripped apart by those floodwaters. First of all, you have most of the water came from beneath the surface of the earth, most of it. And that could easily cover the earth. There's no question about that. Even today, there's water under the surface of the earth that could fill the oceans 3 times over. Okay, they know that. It's a scientific fact. And then you would get the water coming up under great pressure and spewing up, could have been miles up into the sky, and there the rain comes. Because people will say, well, there's not enough rain in the clouds to, yeah, that's right, there isn't. So it has to come from somewhere. And Genesis is very meticulous in telling us, yeah, it came from underneath the earth, you see. And then that spews up. It's going to make rain clouds, and that rain's going to continue for 40 days and 40 nights with no problem whatsoever. Okay. Now, and then you have the upheavals, today we call them tectonic plates that rub against each other. But in the time of Noah, that was a common occurrence for the water to be released from the surface, from below the surface of the earth. Yeah, you had to have great movements of these plates against one another. And what's that going to do? Well, it's going to wreak havoc on the surface of the earth. It's just not going to be the same. Okay. And so you're not going to have the same weather patterns. You're not going to have, everything is going to be a little worse than it was before. Okay. And so if you get these animals that are very sensitive to temperature, to the amount of food, to competition, and they're as big as they are, and they need places to live and breed, and they're not as plentiful, well, you're going to have some animals go extinct, which is what happened with the dinosaurs. As a matter of fact, most of the animals they have figured out, probably 90% of them before the flood went extinct. Yeah. As many animals as we have today, birds, fish, animals, the fossils don't show these same animals. We have to look at these fossils and we see that, wow, this is a completely different animal than we have today. We have nothing to compare to it, which means that animal went extinct. Okay. So here's another reason why we would say Noah didn't take every animal into the ark. Only a representative amount did he take in? And even then, he took in the top of the species. Okay. So you can see how all these things are easily explained and why Genesis is true in every word that it says. Okay. But of course, these men don't believe that. And of course, they're going to be stuck. Now, if you want to be a scientist today, you've got to explain everything, where it all came from. So you make it up. Well, here's what we think is the best scenario of what would have happened. Because we're not going to believe Genesis. What's that? Evolutionist paleontologist from Harvard just died a few years ago. Lewontin is his name. And he says, look, and we have him, you've seen him quoted in our introduction to How the World Was Made in 6 Days. Richard Lewontin says, look, we know our theories don't work. We know they don't work. But here's what separates us from everybody else. We're required by our presuppositions that things don't come into being by some God, speaking and creating something. We're materialists, and every theory that we design is based on materialism. Okay? Physicality, not some supernatural being out there. As a matter of fact, at the end of his quote, he says, we cannot let a divine foot in the door. Because we're scientists, you see. We have to explain everything by physical contact and all this stuff. Well, good luck. Even from you who believe that your theory doesn't work, good luck. But you see, all the other people don't believe in God either. And they're going to go right along with them. Yes, you have to be materialist. You have to explain everything by physicalness and all this stuff. And yeah, the world runs after them. Okay? It's like, the Apocalypse 13 says, and the whole world followed after the beast. Wow. There they go. Why? Because they don't want to believe in God. All right. Okay. So next question from Jake. I'm talking to a Protestant and they claim works are not needed, but they are the result of a person being saved. Okay. Well, I wrote a big book on this called Not by Faith Alone. Now, I sort of give it away in the title, don't I? This is the idea in the Protestant thought that once you have faith, then the conveyor belt of works automatically turns on, and you have just think of like you're at Amazon, and the conveyor belt is carrying package after package. Well, the Protestants believe, well, those packages are all works. Okay, the Protestants believe once you turn on this switch of faith, then the conveyor belt of works just automatically begins to happen. You see, that's their concept, and that is a false concept. And you just go right to James chapter 2 to show them. You see, because James raises that question. Okay, he's got faith, but can that faith save him? What if he meets somebody in the street who's naked, hungry? What is he going to do? Say, well, I have faith in God. He's going to help you. Yes, that's how strong my faith is. He's going to help you. And James says, no, unless you reach down there, give him some clothes and feed him, your faith is worthless. So don't tell me about this faith, working automatically to produce works. Like, wow, it's just automatic. James says, no, it's not automatic. If it was automatic, then we wouldn't have these sin problems in the church like I'm writing about in my 5 chapters. Every chapter that James is writing is dealing with sin in the church. Okay? Just like when Paul writes to the Corinthians, every single chapter is dealing with some sin that's cropped up in the church. And these are people of faith. Okay? So apparently, works don't come automatically once you believe. And then James goes on to say, as a matter of fact, even the devils believe. They probably have stronger faith than you do. But you don't see them producing any works, do you? Okay? So this whole idea that faith automatically produces works is just totally false. It takes effort to do works. That's why he says in the chapter, you show me your faith by your works, I'll show you my faith by my works. Why does he say that? Well, because someone can say he has faith and you don't know whether he's telling you the truth or not. Okay? No way to tell because it's all mental. Okay? But if someone does works, he sees that naked man there in the street and he needs food and clothing, and you go do that, well, you've proven, you see, that now you go do the work. You make the effort to do the work. And so if I say to you, and I have faith also, well, that's easy to believe now because you just did the work. Okay? But someone else can say, I have faith, and I have faith that God's going to take care of you. You see, I'm not going to do it, but God will do it because I have faith in God. You see. So what's the difference? Well, the first guy added works to his faith. Okay. The second guy said he had faith and didn't add works to his faith. And they weren't coming automatically, were they? Okay. So that's the whole difference. So in other words, you have to make a deliberate effort to add works to your faith. And it's easy not to. Okay. It's easy not to. I mean, the first problem James has in chapter 1 is these people, these rich people in the church who have faith. Obviously, they come to church, sing the songs and pray the prayers. And yet they want the highest seats, you see, because they're special people. And you're dressed in these little rags here. You sit over here. Okay? Let the big people, the rich people, make it nice and glorious for God. James says, come on, people. Let me tell you a little story. And sets them straight. Okay. So there's the difference. Okay. All right. Question from Roberto G. God fights for the salvation of the sinner so that he turns away from sin and turns toward God till the very end. True or false? Well, come on, Roberto. You're going to ask me have you stopped beating your wife questions? Okay. This is the way you put it. Okay. God always gives grace to the sinner to repent of his sin. Okay. Even people that aren't Christians, God gives them grace called actual grace to repent of their sin. Because without God's grace, you wouldn't be able to do anything. Okay? But there's this little thing called free will, you see. wherein God gives the grace so he fulfills his side of the bargain. The question is, are you going to fulfill your side of the bargain and use the grace God gave you to repent of your sin? Okay, that's the big question. So, don't ask for true or false when you design the question so that you can condemn either answer. Okay? All right. MK Vine says, Dr. Sungenis, have you ever looked at the data for man-made global warming? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's convincing? Maybe there are natural cycles. Yes, of course there are natural cycles. I remember when I was a kid, we used to have snow drifts that were like 9 feet tall. And it would snow like, I don't know, in the wintertime, once a week. And there'd be ice, and we used to put chains on our tires to drive on the street. And I mean, and then as the years went by, same place that I grew up, just didn't have the same amount of snow. It was definitely, the winters were warmer. And then you'd get another series of winters, and then it would be cold again. And I live in Pennsylvania. I've noticed that the 20 years that I have lived here, the winters are definitely not the same as they were when I first moved here. They're a little warmer, and we don't get as much snow. Okay. What could that be due to? Well, we definitely know there are cycles in the way the sun and its cosmic rays hit the earth. These things vary, okay, from cycle to cycle. But what you need to do in those cases is you need to make an average. So you go back as far as you can, the 1800s, 1700s, as far as those records can be held or taken. And then you see the cycles up and down, but the average stays the same, you see. And the average temperature hasn't even had a difference of 1 degree if you average it out, okay? But the global warmists or the climate changers want us to think that it's just an exponential graph and it's just going to keep on getting warmer and warmer, and and then we're all going to die. Okay. No, it's just not the way it works. Okay. So, yeah, you may be experiencing a little warmer temperatures here or there, but the average will stay the same. Okay. And that's where I'm going to put my chips. I'm not going to go any further. All right, question is it the traditional belief that the 3 main races of humans, white, black, Asian, are descended from the 3 sons of Noah? Well, they could be, okay, and that would be the natural source where you would go. Shem, of course, would be the Semitic peoples and maybe even the Asian peoples. The Japheth would be the, Caucasian, white European kind of, and Ham would be the, the Negroid or, people of that kind of origin. That's a theory. Okay. Now it's a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, but that could be a basic paradigm that you could use. Otherwise, where are they going to come from? Okay, and but there's a lot of variation. After Shem and the let's say Shem was the progenitor of the Semitic peoples. Well, how did the Semitic peoples become Asian? Well, you would have to go through a lot of variations throughout the generations in order for them to produce the Asian people. Okay, but it could have happened. All right, and so that's one factor that we need to keep in mind if we want to use this paradigm that Shem, Ham, and Japheth were the progenitors of our three main races. Okay, all right. What do you think technology was like before the flood? Well, I can tell you this: these guys weren't stupid. Okay, I mean, I've heard of batteries even being available pre-flood. Yeah, they have some ancient, archaeological evidence that people knew about batteries. So if they know about batteries and polarity, negative and positive, and chemicals making that happen, yeah, I'd say these guys weren't as barbaric and primitive as we sometimes think them to be. Okay. We just don't have enough information in scripture because scripture's not interested in that line of thinking. Okay. I mean, we have in Genesis 4, he was the father of flutes. Okay, so they made musical instruments. We know that. Um, we know that they made the Tower of Babel. So they had to know certain artistry of construction, and that takes geometry, and you have to be able to add 2 plus 2 and put it together in a column. So we know that they can do that. Noah made this big boat early in Genesis chapter 6. So you know what it takes to build a boat that size that can hold itself together and function the way it's supposed to function and not top size when the water comes? That takes some ingenuity. Okay, so we get hints that these weren't the primitive caveman that the secular archaeologists and paleontologists are trying to tell us. Okay, they want us to think that these guys were just hunter-gatherers. All they thought about all day long was just when their next meal was going to be arriving on the table, if they had a table. Okay, that's the image that they want us to have. And of course, they spread this out over thousands of years because they believe that the first Homosapien came around 200,000, and depending on your source, or 300,000 BC. Okay, and so they put a lot of time there so that these primitive cavemen can now develop into whatever in the time they think man arrived. Okay, so that would be like a million years before 300,000 BC that they give themselves for this man to develop. Okay, well, the Bible doesn't. The Bible mostly will give 5,000 years up until the time Christ arrived. Okay, so there's no time for anatomical development or feats of engineering that would come in thousands of years. I mean, these men lived and died in their generation, and we already have them producing sophisticated goods and materials in the early chapters of Genesis. Okay, so we can imagine, yeah, they're not these primitive cavemen, looking for their next meal, and that's it. Totally different than what the secularists have tried to impose on the world because they have an agenda. Okay? They have an agenda. I mean, if you think man comes from apes, obviously there's going to have to be some big transitions, and it's going to take a long time. Okay? That's just the nature of their beast. They have to think that way. And what I like to point out is I just find it astounding that nobody's made a big stink about this, but Look, if you have, let's just say you start with 2 Homo sapiens, humans, in 300,000 BC, which is what they say is the time that the first humans arrived, that they finally evolved from ape to human, from hominids that they call them, which is like between apes and humans, to Homo sapiens from the hominids, 300,000 BC. And let's say you have 2 of them. Now, there were many more. If their theory is correct, they would be hundreds of thousands of them. Okay, but we're just going to take 2. And we're going to allow these male and female. And of course, that begs the question, well, where did the female come from? How did the female evolve? Okay, or do you have 2 separate lines of evolution? A female ape making a female human? Or was there some kind of crossover somewhere? Well, they don't explain that, of course. But let's just take male and female Homo sapiens, 300,000 BC, and they start to populate. And let's say we give a population curve of the population doubling every, I don't know, 75 years, which is pretty generous. Okay. And so the population doubles to 4, or you could make the population curve at 50, double to 50. Okay. So, and then from 4, well, you know how fast too, how big it gets once you start doubling it. So you got 2, and then you got 4, then you got 8, then you got 16, then you got 32, then you got 64, then you have 128, and 252, and 526, and then so on and so on. Okay, you see how fast it can grow. Okay, and a population curve will take into account death and disease and all that too. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that. And our average population doubling right now is about 50 years. So in 50 years, we should have 16 billion people on the earth because we got 8 billion now. Okay. So in 7,000 years, what do you think the population will arrive at? Yes. So if you have a 50-year population curve, in 7,000 years, that's 293,000 BC, starting from these 2 Homo sapiens in 300,000 BC, you're going to have 2 trillion Homo sapiens on the earth, just with a 50-year population curve. So if that's the case, where are they? Where are all their graves, their bones? We don't find them on the earth. Nowhere. We've dug down pretty deep. We don't see them. Okay. Now, that's 293,000 BC. Let's go another 7,000 years. What do you think it's going? Well, now you're into the quadrillions. Okay. Wow. And that's just in 14,000 years. So you see, something is amiss. Something's amiss because we don't find evidence of that many people having lived here on the earth. We find very few human bones. And I did some calculations, and if you start from, let's say, 2500 BC, which is when we believe the flood occurred, which would have wiped out all the humans prior to that, of course, okay? And there would be millions of them on the earth when the flood occurred. And you go up to the year 2020 or 2023, where we are now, guess how many people would be on the earth if you had a curve of 50, of doubling the population every 50 years? Yeah, 8 billion. 8 billion. Starting from the 8 that came out of the ark until now, with a 50 population curve, you would have 8 billion people. Now, isn't that something? Okay, so, all right, next question. What do you think technology was like before? Okay, we already did that. How do you explain that the length of the day is not the same throughout the year? I don't know where you got that from, Herbert. Length of the day is, except for a few micron seconds, may change from year to year. Okay, but the length of the day, that's one thing we could depend on. The length of the day, at least the sidereal day, is 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4.09 seconds. Okay, plus or minus a few micron seconds. And you know how small that is. That's a thousandth of a second. And even though it may swing positive to a thousandth of a second, the next year it's going to swing back to negative thousandths of a second. So that also averages itself out. Okay. So one thing we depend on is the length of the day. That's never changed, basically. Okay. All right. Comment from Cindy Moran. Loved your review of the new EMJ book in Culture Wars magazine. Well, thank you, Cindy. Was it funny? I tried to make it funny, but also, full of good information. What Cindy is talking about is I did a review of E. Michael Jones's book, The Dangers of Beauty, in his Culture Wars magazine for December 2022. So if you want to know what that's all about, you'll have to subscribe to Culture Wars and ask for the back issue. But thank you, Cindy. Appreciate your applause. Raghavar Voltare says, Stephen, I love your work exposing modern science, Sir Robert. I enjoy it. I feel like David killing Goliath. Just with 5 smooth stones. And someday I'm going to cut his head off. All right, question. What would your advice be for Catholic actors who play murders or have to do romance scenes and portraying certain characters? Well, Johnny, I think you answered your own question, right? I mean, your conscience tells you you have certain limits, okay? So you bring up 3 examples, but there are probably more, okay? And there are probably more that are severe, okay? So you got to be very careful these days. We're not back in Shakespeare's time, or just about anybody could get up on stage and act out one of Shakespeare's plays and still keep his moral character. Okay. We're just not in that kind of environment anymore. So you need to be doubly careful. I'm not going to give the specifics to you here because I think you already know what they are. Okay. If your conscience is going to bother you about doing any of these scenes, then it's just better not to do them. It doesn't mean that we can't have Catholic actors, okay? But like anything else Catholics do, they're going to have to be careful of how they conduct themselves in an open society. That's just the part of being a Christian, okay? All right. Question from Sapude. Dr. Sungenis, the Book of Tobit has major textual variance. I discovered this when I read the RSVCE and compared it to the NAV when I looked up Tobit 614. How do we know which variant is true? Well, you don't. Okay? I mean, that's part of the mystery of textual criticism is you can make your best educated guess as to what the text is. I go through this every day. I just went through this with, I was doing Luke today. And it was at Luke 23:17. Luke doesn't have, if you look at some of the manuscripts, and one papyri manuscript, one of the more famous ones, Papyri 75, it doesn't have Luke 23:17. And you'll find in most of your Bibles that they don't put it in there. Verse 17 is missing. It goes from 16 to 18. Okay. So, curious jurors going to want to know why. So you go look up the manuscript evidence and you find out that, okay, it looks like it's split right down the middle, because those other famous manuscripts I was talking about, Codex Vaticanus, well, that doesn't have it either. P75, very old papyri, and Codex Vaticanus doesn't have Luke 23:17. But Codex Sinaiticus, which was found right at the same time that Codex Vaticanus was found by Tischendorf, and they match up pretty closely, not in every case, but preponderantly, it doesn't. It does have Luke 23:17. Okay. And then you figure, okay, so if these other manuscripts don't have it, then what decision am I going to make? Well, you can't make a decision because you don't know. All you can do is put, like I did in the footnote, this verse does not appear in this manuscript, this manuscript, this manuscript, this manuscript. But it does appear in this manuscript, this manuscript, this manuscript, this manuscript. That's all you can do. Okay. Now, it's not an alarming thing because it's not a doctrinal issue that we're dealing with here. What does it talk about? I forget what the issue was. So then you do some more study and you find out that Matthew and Mark have that very verse in their text, and it has no textual variance. Neither Matthew nor Mark has a textual variant on this particular verse. Okay. So that helps you arrive at a conclusion that Luke 23:17, even if it's missing from these more these older manuscripts, excuse me, it's okay for us to conclude that it probably was there. Why? Because Mark and Matthew have no discrepancies in the texts at all. Out of 5,000 Greek manuscripts, neither of them have a problem with this verse. So, for all intents and purposes, it should be in, we should have Luke 23:17. Okay. And if a Bible you read does not have it, okay, well, you can pretty much tell that, well, these are probably more liberal textual critics, because the conservative textual critic is not going to want to take a verse out of the Bible unless he is pretty positive that it doesn't belong there. Okay. And you have to have some overwhelming evidence. Like, you would have to have the evidence show that hardly any Greek manuscripts had this passage in there, just a couple. An overwhelming majority of manuscripts did have it. So you would not want to take it out. But you get some more liberal textual critics, and there's a lot of them out there. That's why we have so many different Bibles. Okay. It's, again, the battle between the conservatives and the liberals. The liberal is going to be much more prone to say, oh, take it out. Take it out. Because he's not as sensitive to this inspired word of God. He's looking at the text more from a intellectual basis, not a theological basis. Okay. The conservative will come to it and look at it from a theological and a intellectual basis, but not so much the liberal. Okay. So you get these conflicts all the time in Bible translations. And you're getting them increasingly with Catholic translations. Okay. Now we have the new revised American Bible. Okay. Before we just had the New American Bible, 1971. Then we had the New American Bible, 2011. And now we have the revised New American Bible, 2019. Yeah. And a lot of that is based on somebody making the decision that, this particular sentence or phrase or whatever doesn't belong in the Bible because so-and-so manuscripts, don't have it. So it becomes a judgment issue, the judgment call. Okay. And fortunately, we don't have any of those that really reflect on the doctrine that we believe. Okay. These are just historical events that happened. Okay. And so it's not going to affect how we believe in Jesus or something. Okay. But to answer your questions, we don't know. We don't know for sure. We just make an educated guess that it is or should not be in the text. Okay. Okay. Yahweh in the Bible and Rig Veda Yahweh may be related. I don't know what you're talking about there, Ragavar. What's Rig Veda? Is that you getting that from Hindu religion? So I can't give any thoughts on that. I've never heard of Rig Veda. I'm suspicious because of what it sounds like, because I do know about Hindu religion. But I'm not going to make any more guesses from here. All right, so I've got about 12 more minutes here because, as I said, I've got to get out of here. And I think that may be the call I'm waiting for. Hold on, people. Hello? Good. Yeah. Okay. Can you? Yeah. Oh, really? Yeah. Non-repairable. Okay. All right. Yeah. Do you have them in stock? Can you get it done before 5? Great. I'll be there before 5. Thank you. Okay, sounds good. Bye-bye. Uh-huh. Well, I just found out that I had to get 4 new tires on the car. We had a flat today. The flat's not repairable. And 2 front tires were practically bald. So he just talked me into getting 4 new tires. So, yeah, see, I have to pay my bills just like everybody else does. All right. So, next question. So, I'm going to have to leave here in 10 minutes. So, sorry to cut it short today. All right. Question, Dr. Sungenis, why did God give David multiple wives in 2 Samuel 12 if it is not good for a king to have multiple wives? Did God will David to have this, or is this just God's providence? Well, it's just one of those things where in Deuteronomy, God said a king should not multiply wives. Okay, that's a fact. Then things were sort of smoothed over with David, wherein this became a practice that was not looked askance in the time of Samuel, which is now you're talking about 400 years later. Okay. This is because at this time in Deuteronomy, where in 18, where it was given, Israel was all by itself. Then they became part, as you know, God gave them kings because they wanted kings. Okay, so here's another parallel to the foreign wives thing. God says, I'm your king. And Israel said, well, we want a king like the nations. And so God says, okay, you can have your king. Okay, so in that sense, God conceded. It was not the design in the Pentateuch for the theocracy of Israel to have any other leader than God. Okay. But now the people wanted a king like the nations, and so God conceded and let them have a king. And Saul was the first king, David was the second, Solomon was the third, so on and so on. Okay. So things changed. The whole mentality changed. The same thing or something similar happened to multiple wives. We know that for a fact with Solomon. Okay, 300 wives, 700 concubines. I mean, this guy, hit the limit or over the limit. David had 8 wives. Okay, but by this time, you could say that God had conceded. They multiple wives was not a sin, just like having a king wasn't a sin. It just wasn't good for the people, the society. But if they wanted it, sometimes God conceded and gave it to them. Okay, just like the divorce law in Deuteronomy 24. God hates divorce, as it says in Malachi. I always hated divorce. But they wanted divorce. So God said, okay, go ahead, you can have divorce. Okay, so in that sense, God conceded. And then we find out from Jesus that it was because of the hardness of your heart. So, yeah, God conceded, but and it wasn't sin. You could divorce without sinning. Okay, it just wasn't good for the people. If you want an optimal society, let God be the leader, so you don't need a king. Nobody divorces, and nobody has multiple wives. Okay, if you did them, they weren't sinful, but not good for the society. So God could concede without leading the people into sin, of course. Okay. And at this time in the nations, that's exactly what the nations were doing. The kings had multiple wives. And so the Israelites wanted to be like the nations, you see. They didn't want to be peculiar. And of course, none of these things were good for them. And we know from even last week when I talked about this, somebody asked me about Solomon. What do we know about Solomon's eternal destiny? And I said, it doesn't look good. Because in 1 Kings 11, it says basically he apostatized from God because of his wives. Okay? So we see God's wisdom there. Don't have multiple wives because it's not going to lead you down a good path. Okay? But if you do, you haven't sinned, you're just probably setting yourself up for the next sin. And that's how we would look at it. Okay? Not the best situation, but that's the situation. All right. All right. Dr. Sungenis, you seem to have criticized the modern way of praying the Rosary, the many repetitions of Hail Mary. Does the church then, by promoting this form of the Rosary, harm souls? No, not at all. Many people love the Rosary. Okay. I'm just one of those peculiar guys that have trouble with the repetition. Okay. I'm just me. Okay. I never liked repetition. I just don't get involved with it. Okay. But that's me. And I don't run the church. Okay. Um, so no, I would not say that it's harming souls at all. If anything, it does those souls good. If that's the way they prefer to pray, so be it. Okay. Um, so I have no say in that whatsoever. All right. Question: why can't satellites, geostationary and or orbiting satellites, be considered black and white evidence of geocentrism, especially considering geostationary satellites arguing against relativism? Well, because if you start with the Newtonian mechanics and you believe that that is the way things run, wherein you have the centripetal force is controlled by gravity, and the planet or satellite is given an inertial thrust that keeps it moving at 7,000 miles per hour by its own momentum. And then you add the centripetal force from the gravity of the Earth, it's going to make that satellite go around in a circle around the Earth. Okay. So if that's your physics, then it makes sense. Okay. The question is that the right physics? Okay. And people have been questioning Newtonian physics for quite a while, not only because it can't answer certain things, um, but because it believes that there's this centrifugal effect on the satellite that looks like a real force, but they just call it an effect. So is their mechanics starting from ground zero correct in that it calls something just an effect or a fictitious force when it actually looks like a real force? Now, what I'm saying is, let's say you're driving in your car 60 miles an hour and you suddenly turn your wheel to the right. What are you going to feel? Well, everything in that car is going to be smashed against the left side of the car by some force. Some force is pushing it. Okay. That's the way other people look at it. And Newton says, well, no, it's not really a force. It's just, you've changed your inertial path and that makes it look like a force, but it's not really a force. Okay. Well, okay, you can have that view, but is that the reality? Is that the actual reality? Or is there really a force there? Yeah, centrifugal force in space that if you deviate, you're going to feel that force. Okay, so this is the question that has to be answered by physics. All right, and we've had Machian physics, we've had Einsteinian physics give different answers to those questions. So Newton's not the only game in town, okay, any longer. Used to be, but not any longer. Either way, though, it's not going to prove geocentrism. Geocentrism is going to have another way to explain a geostationary satellite that's not Newtonian. It may borrow some concepts or overlap with some concepts of Newtonian physics, but not be exactly like Newtonian physics, obviously. Okay. Otherwise, we'd all be heliocentrists. So, all right. So with that, I've got to go. And it's been nice being with you again. And we'll be back next week at 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. And if I haven't answered your question tonight, then I will try to answer it tomorrow. I hope that I have been informative for you and that you have gotten closer to the Lord God, Yahweh, Jehovah, this afternoon by the information given to you. Praise be Yahweh, Jehovah, Almighty God. And we'll see.